and actually start recording. Okay, now I'll begin again. Hi, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And I'm very excited today that we will be hosting this very interesting conversation about whether ancient languages are necessary. My co-host will be, as usual, Alexandra Hudson, who is an award-winning journalist, author, speaker, as well as the founder of Civic Renaissance, a newsletter and intellectual community dedicated to moral and cultural renewal. And this wonderful webinar will also have as a guest is Lalia Lloyd. She's an Athens-based teacher and writer who has spent a lifetime living and teaching classics. She was raised by a classicist and studied in Cambridge under Mary Beard. In between, she won a prize for the Times Literary Supplement. More recently, she taught classics at Eton. She holds an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia and is working on a book about ancient and modern Greece. Other current projects include editing a forthcoming biography on Marcus Aurelius for Yale UP. So I want to say thank you very much to Lexi and to Lalia for joining us today. Now, my two lovely interlocutors already know that unfortunately I am still recovering from a bit of a chest infection, as my dear readers will also know, so I will probably be somewhat quiet. So I want to turn us over first to Lalia. What we're going to be discussing a little bit, just as a premise, is that, you know, about a year ago, Princeton decided to scrap ancient Greek and Latin as requirements for classic students. And this has sparked a really interesting debate. And what I'd like for us to go over today is kind of the ideas of the ancient languages, but also whether they're necessary for classic students and also by extension further to the general public and non-academics. So I'm going to turn over to Lalia now to start us off with a little introduction into the ancient languages themselves, of which we will be discussing today.
Thank you, Anya, and hello, everyone. So first of all, I just wanted to say a few words on what exactly it is we mean by classics. So in the UK, where I was a teacher of classics for the best part of a decade, what we mean when we talk about classics is studying the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome, but doing it to a large extent through the medium of their languages, which has meant historically that people who have had access to these languages have had the advantage when it comes to pursuing classics as a degree at university. Obviously, they're not easy languages, and it takes a certain number of years to become proficient. Of course, that said, it is entirely possible to have an appreciation of and to study the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome without the languages. In the UK, you can study ancient history, classical civilization, and you can engage with the cultures through the literature, the history, and the philosophy in translation. And let us not forget, of course, the architecture and the art and the archaeology of these civilizations. Clearly, you don't need to speak Greek to be able to look at the Parthenon and appreciate how unbelievably beautiful it is. In addition, though, I would say that on the archaeology note, you would need some Latin or Greek if you were going to study inscriptions. And that's quite interesting. Always new inscriptions are being unearthed, and we always need experts on hand to engage with these finds. So this brings me a little bit to my first point. As I was thinking about and preparing for this talk, a couple of words kept popping up in my mind. The first one was expertise. To appreciate Latin civilization, Greek civilization, you can do so without a knowledge of the languages. And there are good translations out there. And I hope that we will be saying something about translations later on. But can you move beyond being an appreciator and being engaged with these cultures without a knowledge of the languages? Can you be an expert without the languages? So expertise and experts is one of the words that I've been thinking about. And I don't think you can be an expert on the literature and the philosophy and the history without the languages. The question posed by the seminar is, should Latin and Greek be requirements of the classics? And I think that if one of the aims of a classics degree is to produce experts in their field, then absolutely, I would say that you do have to have some level of competence in the ancient languages themselves in order to engage with the literature and the inscriptions in the original language. So apart from expertise and experts, the other word which keeps coming to mind for me is power. So understanding the original languages gives you the power to understand the texts and the civilizations, and indeed the mindset of the ancient cultures, in ways that cannot be done through translations. And of course, this is also true of other languages and other cultures, both modern and ancient. But just going back to this idea of expertise, the idea of studying at a university like Cambridge or Oxford now, it is being widened and opened up to people who do not have access to classics anymore at school. So Cambridge has a 4-year degree where they will teach you Latin and Greek from scratch, and the same thing at Oxford. So what's happening now, which is really, really delightful to me, is that we are kind of nurturing a generation of experts who are from previously excluded backgrounds. And we are actually allowing power to be concentrated in more and more hands. Because I do think that, as we will discuss in the rest of this talk, the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome are too important to not keep talking about, to not keep generating experts of every background in. We need to keep creating experts, and we need to keep creating experts who can argue with one another, who can keep the conversation going. I mean, if we think about classics as a discipline, it covers a really vast swathe of time. The first Greek inscriptions are from 1400 to 1200 BC. Latin is first written down in 700 BC. We cover a huge amount of Europe, of Asia, of North Africa. We need to keep producing experts and concentrating, making sure that power is not concentrated in the hands of a small elite. And finally, I just wanted to say a little thing about the value of Latin and Greek for learners of any age. So we tend to think of Latin and Greek in these very kind of stereotyped kind of terms that it's too difficult, it's methodical, maybe it's too methodical, perhaps it's even boring. But my experience of teaching in the UK has been that actually there are many students who love and who really benefit from the kind of structure that traditional classics teaching imposes on the mind. So not only does it help with other ancient and modern languages, but it helps with many other disciplines as well. So yeah, I think I would sum up by saying an appreciation of the classical world can be absolutely had through secondary sources, through secondary material, through translations. But what we want is to be having experts in every generation. And I think to keep the level of expertise up, we need to keep the languages being taught, because that's really where the power kind of lies, in having access to the original texts. And this is aside from the kind of secondary benefits of studying Latin and Greek, which give you, first of all, if you're a speaker of English, which many of us may not have English as our first language, but if it is, 60% of English is derived from Latin and Greek. So it gives you an enormous ability to think metaphorically and to make connections linguistically, even in your own language. Yeah, so expertise and power and an ability to make connections across languages. I think that it's really important that we keep the languages at the forefront for studying these ancient cultures.
Thank
which is
you,
not
Elia.
saying,
Yeah, sorry. You want to finish?
Yeah. No, go for it.
No, I just want to say thank you. And I think that the excellent point about translation. And I think it's interesting that right now, a lot of people in the last few years, for instance, we were just talking before this event began about Emily Wilson and how excited everybody was about Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, because she translated some words very differently from previous ones, especially from sort of a female perspective, with regards to, specifically, she mentions the slave girls that were sort of very derogatorily referred to in previous translations as, sluts or wenches or that kind of things. So that by having a woman translate it, she brought a different perspective. And I think, so your idea about the power of future translations, that if we want translations to only get better, we need to encourage students of all backgrounds to be engaging with the original text, because they're going to have different perspectives. And that's really invaluable, that they'll be able to interpret it in ways that maybe, Victorian scholars didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about the way that, for example, a character like Socrates was all about knowledge not being concentrated in one person's hand, in one person's mind. He walked barefoot around Athens and would talk to anybody, would share his philosophical ideas with anybody. So it's very much, I think, in the spirit of the classical tradition to not keep knowledge as kind of exclusive. Actually, it's got to be for everyone.
And to sort of show how different time periods can translate things. Like, and my regular readers will know that I'm a big fan of Sappho. I've got my children's book I wrote about Sappho. And it's very funny because, there's a whole kind of couple 100-year period where Sappho's poetry was completely translated differently, simply because what she was writing didn't really gel with the current society's norms and values. So they would change the gender in order to not be two women in their minds, and I mean, of course, this is a whole nother conversation, but the idea is that you can see the translation filtering through this current society's norms and expectations. So if every time we need new translations, the only way we can kind of really get at the idea of it is to get to the original text, because otherwise we're really understanding a filter of a certain time, a place, or a person.
Which is in itself incredibly valuable, actually. And it's one thing that makes classics such a wonderful discipline, because we've been translating Latin and Greek for, centuries. And it's great that you can have this sort of, it's like a time machine, because you've got the Greek or the Latin. You can also look at the translation of the period and say, look, we've got a sense of what was important to this culture at this time in the way that they interpreted the Latin. With my other hat on, I'm a biographer, and somebody very wise once said to me, we need a new biography of a figure every 10 years. And I would say it's the same for classics. We need a new translation of these important works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, just to mention just a few, Sappho. We need new translation every generation. Really, we need a new translation. If
now,
minimum.
Now to sort of show the other side, though, because I do think there is a point to bring up on the other spectrum, and I guess a few terms need to be sort of determined. one is kind of the idea of requirement. Like, I think maybe taking away the requirement of knowing ancient Greek and Latin as entry points is probably, we would agree, a good one, because that allows people from different backgrounds who might not have had access to an ancient Greek education to come. So there is, I think it's important to distinguish that the requirements to entry have been reduced, but then also requirements during the course. And I think another question would be to determine what level of proficiency, because, you know, the study of philology or ancient languages is a very rigorous, specific type of study and might not be necessarily catering to every type of classic student. If they know enough to have the tools to translate where they need to versus being very proficient, because that is a huge qualifying level of how proficient does proficient need to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously there are translators out there who are, I won't name any, but who are able to create new translations in English without actually having an in-depth great working knowledge of the language. So often, you know, poets and so on and writers will, you know, they will work with somebody who has an expertise in order to produce, you know, that poem, which will be, you know, that translation, which will be known for a generation. So, you know, I think that working collaboratively is really important. And I think that you don't need to have a very high level of proficiency. You know, if what we want to do is expand the number of people who are engaging with the classical world, then I think it's fine to say, okay, you don't need to be that proficient. But I think you know, one needs to maintain a certain number of people, probably the teachers, who are proficient, who do have this in-depth knowledge. But if what we're doing is, if we're thinking about kind of creating a kind of cadre of competent, interested semi-experts, I think that there's place for that as well, for sure.
I think that's the core difference, or the core distinction between Lalia's argument and maybe how I would approach this, which is, you know, there's the big C classics, the discipline, the study of ancient Greek and Roman Latin literature and culture and life. And then there is small C classics, kind of just, you know, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. That's a classic book. It's like just a great work of art or literature that is not exclusively tied to that specific time and place of ancient Greece and Rome, and that has traditionally had an explicitly normative role in education, like, you know, helping us engaging great texts from across history and across culture for character formation, for giving us a vision of the good and heroes to inspire us, that again are not explicitly that exists. Those texts and figures exist in ancient Greece and Rome, but they exist in other cultures and in other eras of history as well. And so if you're not coming at that from an exclusively academic perspective, you're not planning to go into that academic discipline or teach ancient languages or teach classics, and you just want to, you know, derive the benefits of the great conversation for its own sake, for its beauty, for its enjoyment, for its ennobling purposes and value, then maybe it's not necessary. I would not recommend starting, you know, learning Latin, or I would not make it a requirement, rather, to learn ancient Greek and Latin before picking up Plato, or before picking up St. Augustine or Cicero, that you can read really high quality, wonderful translations of their work and enjoy them without that language requisite.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I mean, I think that you can't start with, like, you know, learning the language in order to read a bit of Plato would be, I think,
unnecessarily inhibitive.
Dragging the cart before the horse, or, you know, whatever.
Plato is so beautiful to read in English in translation. I can't imagine how beautiful it must be to read in the original classical Greek.
And I mean, and the other thing that also what one shouldn't knock translations. I mean, there's
Yes.
what I love is I've done some work on metaphor, and the word translation is linguistically identical to the word metaphor. So translatio is from transfero in Latin, which is the same as metaphero. It means to carry across. So it's a carrying across of meaning from one object onto another, or from one symbol onto another. So actually, when we engage in an act of translation, we're engaged in an act of metaphorization, actually. And this means that, you know, what are metaphors? Well, the metaphors allow us to make deeper connections, have our minds opened to connections between objects and ideas and linguistic kind of phenomena. So actually, you know, it's easy to see translation as the kind of like the poor man's version, like, oh, well, if you can't do it in the original, then you might as well read a translation. No, I mean, translations give you something. Translations can add a richness to your appreciation. So to start with a good translation, or even an okay translation, and then move on to the original is, you know, of course, Plato is he's quite beautiful. I mean, I think Plato's he's more interesting. I mean, I don't think Plato's language is so beautiful. I think he's funny. And I think that he is richly rewarding. But probably there are things you can get in Plato in great translations. You know, there's, for example, I think there's a huge amount of humor in Plato. And I think that you can get the humor of Plato in a translation, as well as you could reading it in Greek. So I mean, starting with a translation in your language, brilliant. That's a brilliant way to begin.
Oh, go ahead, Anya.
No, I was just going to say one little thing that with regards to language, in general, I think it's important to have some introduction to how ancient languages just work. And that might even be like watching a documentary or like one little thing that you don't have to like get it deeply into it, but a way a language works can really open up your mind to understanding the whole culture. And, you know, because I think when you think about it, we think in our languages, you know what I mean? They really determine who we are. And I always make this example, like the difference between English speakers and Spanish speakers. There's fundamental differences in the language that, like in Spanish, for instance, you can say se rompió. Like the vase can break itself. In English, we can't do that. Vases can never break themselves. We have to break them. There's always somebody accountable. And what happens is English speakers are always able to find accountability, even in accidents, whereas Spanish speakers are more likely to allow accidents to be truly accidents and not find people culpable. So it changes our entire way of thinking. So think about the first time you learn some ancient Greek concepts and they don't translate perfectly in English. So you're like, okay, you could write a whole book about Xenia or Kleos or these kind of things. And just even learning like 5 words or 10 words in ancient Greek and understanding their concepts, I think opens up the book enormously. I mean, any of the literature enormously. So it's like, in some ways, I wonder if between just being happy with translations and having to be proficient, maybe there's like a whole spectrum of involvement you can take depending on your ability, your time, and your interest.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Anya. And I love Lalia's insight about the etymological and linguistic connection between metaphor and translation. I think that's fascinating. And Emily Wilson makes that point in the introduction to her translation of the Odyssey, where she says that every work of translation is its own discrete work of art, because you're not just, you know, inserting this text into Google Translate and getting an exact rendering. You're translating it culturally as well. Like how am I going to make this make sense to a modern contemporary, you know, audience? And specifically, where our positions on this, Lalia, intersect. I think Emily, your position being that classical languages are important to academics, and classical languages are less important to like the lay reader that just wants to read ancient Greek and Latin literature for its own sake and not as an academic exercise. I think our positions intersect in another insight that Emily Wilson has about past translations of the Odyssey, where she says past translations were written primarily for other academics. So they were written to impress people that were also familiar with the ancient languages. And she also talks about how Alexander Pope's translation of the Odyssey wasn't necessarily very accurate, but it was beautiful. Like you can't make the Odyssey rhyme in English.
Mhm.
As you're translating it, if you're not taking some creative liberties there. Like that's definitely its own work. But she made the point, she wanted this to be widely read. She wanted her translation to be widely read and incredibly accessible. And that's why she chose to use just the simple, common denominator kind of rendering that she did, while still being as true and honoring to the original text as she could. I remember the one example that this was actually on her Twitter feed, not anything in the introduction to the Odyssey, where she talked about painstakingly trying to capture a little nibble that was offered to maybe Telemachus by Menelaus or something. And she chose the word canape, which definitely doesn't exist in ancient Greek, but like we're familiar, like very millennial, right? To have a cocktail party and offer some canapes, some little nibbles and libation. But like she chose that very intentionally. So anyway, I just think it's a really interesting point that each work of translation is its own work of art. And I really appreciate translators like Emily Wilson that have an eye to translating for a broader audience and not just trying to impress their peers in the niche academic discipline of the classics.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Can I just interject very quickly and tell you guys the poll results from the first half, because I'd like to maybe go into the more general public a bit more in a second. But for the first question, which is, do you think ancient Greek and Latin should be requirements for classic students? 66% said yes, 6% no, and 28% said at least one ancient language. And the second question is, do you think non-academics should study ancient languages in order to understand the classics? And 68% said yes, some level of study is necessary. 23% said only if they have time, and 9% said not necessary, translations are great. So I would like to make one other point, which is, the idea from Princeton, and I mean, they said as much, is that by reducing the requirements, they wanted to open it up to a more vibrant community, that they wanted to have people from different backgrounds that, historically were not there. But for people who've been, I think actually Lalia posted this really great article about living Latin, and that there's this movement to be teaching Latin in Latin, and that there are articles being posted academically in Latin. And I just think maybe it's kind of ironic because I live in South America. Learning Latin in South America is not that tricky. Actually, a lot of the people who are proponents for living Latin are Latinos. I mean, it kind of makes sense. So it's interesting that for the point of at least one ancient language, maybe some people who are more fascinated in ancient languages will want to take up ancient Greek, but Latin is a pretty accessible language for millions of people who are native Latin-based language speakers. So that as a requirement is not actually that far-fetched.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that maybe Latin is at least one ancient language, and to another point is that, which I actually had a reader write in, which I thought was a great point, was that there are lots of other ancient languages, not just Greek and Latin. And so perhaps we should allow people to study ancient Assyrian or Babylonian if they wish, or Egyptian, or that
Sanskrit or Hebrew, Old Irish. Like these are all very, very, very old languages. That there is great literature written in these languages, like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these Indian epics written in Sanskrit. They're incredibly riveting and interesting, and they've been compared to the Iliad, the Odyssey for a long time for good reason. So it's a good point, Anya.
I think this is where we come into, and it's I'm loath to kind of get political or get I mean, I think this is where we kind of start running into these issues of, you're absolutely right, like, why aren't we learning Sanskrit? And I think that if you are a European language speaker, we find Greek quite difficult, but Greek is, at least the alphabet is based, well, actually the Latin alphabet is based on the Greek alphabet. Although it's hard, it's easier than, for example, trying to learn Sanskrit or Hebrew. I mean, actually Hebrew did used to be, Latin, Greek and Hebrew did used to be the kind of three main pillars of English university teaching. Hebrew not so much anymore, definitely, obviously Latin and Greek. But yeah, I mean, this is where we start to see a bit of a European bias, unfortunately, which is that actually there are other ancient languages which we should be reading, but if your mother tongue, if the alphabet that you're used to reading is the Roman alphabet, obviously Latin and Greek are just easier to access because there isn't that initial kind of scary jump of having to learn a new alphabet, because that is something that puts people off, is the unfamiliarity of a new alphabet, for sure.
It's so funny for me. I'm really bad at vocabulary. I find that very boring. I love learning alphabets. Like, it's the only thing I like doing. Alphabets and like basic structure.
Yeah, somebody's just putting some lovely an alphabet that I cannot understand in the chat.
And I'm the opposite, Anya, where I'm riveted by etymological links between our current language and ancient languages. Greek, there's so much of Greek and Latin in our language and English today, but also other linguistic influences as well. And so that's more where my interest is beyond the alphabet. One other point I wanted to make about the even the focus on ancient languages for the discipline of classics in particular. Our first conversation that Anya and I hosted several months ago now was with Dr. Eric Adler, who is a classicist at the University of Maryland. And his argument in his book called The Battle of the Classics was that the discipline of the classics had become too focused on the languages, the study of ancient Greek and Latin, at the expense of the ultimate goal of having these of the language being instrumental to engaging these texts at a more intimate level for their normative, character forming, elevating purposes, where people he thought that people make that case for the study of ancient languages today. And he also recounted a debate in elite academic institutions in America about 100 years ago at Harvard and Yale, where they were having the same conversation. Should we make ancient languages a requirement for any student to be educated here? And he argued that it was a mistake to approach the study of ancient languages just saying it's for mental rigor, like it's a way to sharpen the mind and kind of test knowledge and just test memorization. And he said that if you're going to have that argument, like just do a crossword puzzle or play Sudoku or something like that. Like that's not necessarily the best argument for studying ancient languages. He said we should revive the appreciation, the instrumental appreciation of learning these languages, so that we can read Plato and fall in love with beauty and goodness and truth all over again. Or two, I'm a Christian, and this morning I was reading through Koine Greek, a textbook I have for Koine Greek with my son, and that's an instrumental reason why I would love to know Koine Greek, so I can read the Greek New Testament in its original. I've heard it's like reading the New Testament or any work in its original language is like watching color television, and reading a translation is like black and white. And so that's a goal of mine one day, to be able to do that for that instrumental reason.
I was just having a look at some notes that I was making earlier, and I wrote something down, which was I'll just tell you what I wrote, because otherwise I won't be able to paraphrase. I said, because we can never be exactly sure or exact about the meaning of a translation, many interpretations are possible. A bit like if you're critiquing a poem, and it makes the discussion richer. And I think there's something that we all like to be certain. And of course, I've been banging on about expertise and power and all of this, but there is a huge amount of delight and a huge amount of important conversation that happens when people are not sure. And so, you know, and I think that, like, we need to, you know, this is another reason why we need to keep coming back to the text in the original, because we will argue over what they mean, actually. And you know, as we both, I think, agree, the conversations that were happening in ancient Greece, the discussions that they were happening, you know, we were talking about, you know, Antigone and what's the right way to rule, what's the right way to be a citizen. Because we have still not answered the questions that were posed by the ancients, we continually arguing, we may never answer these questions. One way of kind of ensuring that we stay engaged is by allowing ourselves to be unsure, like letting in uncertainty, actually. I'd be really interested to know what members of the audience actually think about that.
I think we're turning to questions very shortly, so I'd be interested to hear what people on this call think as well. But Lalia, that point also gets to your comments at the introduction at the beginning of this conversation about this, your position about knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin being a requirement for classic students, being about power, and how the more eyes and perspectives and people of different backgrounds that come to these texts, in the original especially, they bring different insights and different aspects of the human experience to it that are really important perspectives that have been missed throughout history, because it was mostly men, white men that had the privilege, the time to study these languages. And now that we live in this wonderful age where we have more free time and leisure and access to resources that can help us do this for ourselves. And when people with more diverse backgrounds have the opportunity to engage these texts, so those are really important perspectives that can bring new insights to these texts that do have important observations about the human experience, timeless observations, timeless questions, as you've alluded to. Well, yeah, great. It's a great point.
If you guys want to move to some questions, I can try reading them. If I falter, I'll have to pass you back to Lexi. I apologize. But the first one, I think, is directly to Lalia, probably, that since it's been almost 2,000 years since anybody actually spoke ancient Greek or Latin, aren't we always now using a translation with no firsthand knowledge of the original context?
No, that's not quite right. No, I suppose it depends what you mean by context. I mean, obviously we have very few, we don't have, for example, a copy of the Odyssey from the 6th century, a full copy of the Odyssey from the 6th century BC. Clearly these texts were they were rewritten and they were passed down and they were transmitted. And but we definitely, to the best of our knowledge, we have texts in Latin and Greek which are almost identical to texts that were being read and disseminated in the ancient world. So yeah, we are obviously, context is a very different point. Yeah, I mean, we have to make an imaginative leap in terms of the context in which these things were written, and we're always just doing the best we can with classics, which is also, it's another thing that makes it such an interesting discipline. Like I said before, the spaces between knowledge is what's really interesting. You're trying to do your best to not guess, but use all the knowledge at your fingertips to imagine the context in which these things were written. So we're not, if I understood the question right, we're definitely using the original texts for our discussions in Latin and Greek, and we have translations also. We have several things at our fingertips, but yeah, we have to make imaginative leaps to assume the kind of context in which they were written. But we have information to help us imagine the context as well. I hope I answered that right.
Yeah, and I think also in some ways the language it's always been continuous. Like people have always been studying ancient Greek and Latin. It's never been like a break where nobody did for a long time, then we had to like relearn it. I mean, there was always somebody. I mean, it's part of a chain. The next question I think actually will be better answered by Lexi because of our previous event that we've done. And the question is, are there any attempts to bring the study of classic languages to underprivileged students at all? Often marginalized, do not have resources to incorporate the same topics into study that those of us who are more privileged do. I worry that students of different backgrounds may be left to the wayside without some way to accommodate the differences afforded in opportunities.
Yeah, so I was it our last conversation, Anya, with Roosevelt Montes from Columbia University. His recent book called Rescuing Socrates was a case for the great conversation, the study of ancient Greek and Roman literature, but also those that came after that era as well, for everyone. He had a very democratic approach, and both so his story is interesting. He came to America from the Democratic Republic at a young age. He was maybe 10 or 11, and he moved to Brooklyn, and he was in his neighborhood in Brooklyn. He walked past his neighbor's trash, and he saw a collection of the Mortimer Adler University of Chicago great books, just sitting there. Just someone had thrown them away. And he picked up the copy of that had Plato's dialogues in it, and he took it home, and that was his first exposure to Plato, and he basically never looked back. He just fell in love, and he now teaches, or he has taught, and was part of forming the sort of great books core requirement at Columbia, or he administered that for a while, and so his book is kind of it's part memoir, part argument for the humanities and the classics today, where he talks about how the great books changed his life, and he argues that that other people can benefit from them too. His story in many interesting ways parallels another very prominent member in the Big C classical community, Dan L. Paideia. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing his name, but he was the one who was profiled in the New York Times last January about canceling the classics, and he was the one that talked about how the discipline of the classics he thought was inherently racist, white supremacist, and wanted to dismantle it from within. So Dan L's story, he also came from the Dominican Republic and fell in love, found consolation, found comfort in the classics, which is why he did his PhD in classics and why he's a professor of classics today at Princeton University. So it seems like Dan L. and Roosevelt come at this from totally different, similar backgrounds, but different perspectives. One wants to dismantle it, and one wants to democratize the classics, yet they agree on a lot and actually co-administer a summer program that teaches the classics. And I think there is a language component to it, to underprivileged kids in New York City, which is wonderful. I just love how it kind of comes full circle. So I think that a way to square that and square Dan L's position is that he's criticizing the way in which the discipline of classics, Big C classics today is administered and propagated on privileged. And he wants to critique that, but at the same time sees the enormous value of giving students of all backgrounds, especially underprivileged and minority students, the opportunity to engage with these timeless questions and ideas about the human condition and what it means to live a meaningful life. So all that to say, the question was, do these things exist? Yes, they do. And the more we can encourage them, support them, highlight them, replicate them, the better.
And I think it's wonderful that despite the portrayed extreme differences of Montes and Padella, that they are both involved in this program to teach
Yeah. I
marginalized
think they
kids.
co-founded it, or at least they're co-leaders
Yeah.
today, which is wonderful.
So to a more specific question with regards to Latin, and this is said, I'm very fond of my Greek English interlinear New Testament. Does anyone know of a Latin English interlinear New Testament? I think it would be very helpful for students learning Latin. And as far as I can see, no one has ever done this, but I stand to be corrected. Anyone want to help me with this project?
I don't know why we would translate the New Testament into Latin. I mean, that's I mean, it sounds like a great intellectual it sounds like a great sort of intellectual undertaking, but I suppose usually when we think about reading the New Testament, we just want to read it in the original, so we want to read it in Greek. But I don't know of an interlinear in Latin, but nor am I sure if I really want to translate the New Testament from Greek into Latin, but maybe if I had a couple of years off, I might think about it.
Yeah, it's a great point, Lilia, that it might be just a great intellectual exercise, but there are so many great works that haven't even been translated into English yet that I think would reach and benefit a far wider audience. Another event that Anya and I have done together as part of this great conversation series is with James Hankins, Dr. James Hankins, intellectual historian at Harvard University. He is the founder of the Itati Classical Library. I guess it's not called the Classical Library, but the Itati, which is the Italian analog to the Loeb Classical Library, where it has the Italian on one side and the English translation on the other. And he is constantly, he's a wonderful friend and mentor of mine. I'm so grateful for his friendship because he's constantly referencing and highlighting, directing my attention to Italian Renaissance authors. And the Italian Renaissance is that's actually the way in which I was introduced to the classical world. I focused on modern European history for my undergrad, and then wanted to learn more about all the authors and thinkers that influenced the Renaissance thinkers that I had fallen in love with. But he's always quoting and referencing texts and authors that he's read and is familiar with in the original Italian, but that nobody has translated yet. So because I don't know Italian, I'll never, and until I do learn Italian, maybe one day, I won't be able to enjoy these authors. And so one project I love the idea of taking on one day, maybe when I become independently wealthy or when someone else decides to support this project, is to just commission the translation of some of these texts and authors that have incredible value and could have the possibility to benefit lots of people, but we just are lost to us and are lost to modernity because they're not translated yet. And I'm sure there are lots of examples of that in ancient Greek and also in Latin.
I do want to give a shout out to Le Belette, the French publishing company. Classical Wisdom was originally co-founded with the idea of helping Le Belette, and they're actually the last publishing house that still does critical translations of untranslated texts. And for each translator to approach some of these ancient Greek texts, they have to know like 3 or 4 different versions of ancient Greek, Attic, Coptic, all that kind of stuff. So it's only an endeavor that the French would still pursue very actively. But they have like a team of about 50 translators that still work on untranslated documents. And to your point, this brings up the next question. I think we should also include Etruscan. And I'm still hoping that Claudius's lost work on Etruscan will show up. Any signs of it yet? Valia, do you have any insights on what's happening with Etruscan?
Sorry, what was the last thing you said? You said something about Claudius?
Yeah, Claudius's work on Etruscan, will that ever be found?
I don't know. I mean, I did go to a very interesting talk at Cambridge quite a few years ago now, actually, where they were doing some research into Oscan, which is another one of those Italian language groups, which was, basically obliterated by the Romans. Because, if you look at a language map of Italy, Latin was just spoken by this absolutely tiny little sliver. And then they just went and just brutally beat everybody up and just obliterated all the languages, and then everybody was speaking Latin. I mean, Etruscan's one of those sort of really interesting kind of mystery languages. But I mean, what we need is, hopefully we're going to have more people studying classics. I mean, I do think that more people are getting interested in it, and it does seem to be kind of, participation does seem to be widening. So I think the more people are, at university studying Latin, we'll probably have some more people working on Etruscan as well. But I think it's slightly limited by the fact that there's no Rosetta Stone, and the number and the quality of inscriptions that we have in Etruscan are just not quite there. So we need more inscriptions, or we need a different variety, or we need to find the Rosetta Stone before we can crack that little one.
Well, I spent a summer once in Cortuna, and underneath the basilica, there's the Tabla Cortinisa, or whatever, and it's like beautiful. It's so cool to see the Etruscan work, to go even further back than the Latins. But as you say, like we have so little information. It does make it tricky. I did have another question for you with regards to Latin, though. And this might be like a good one for you, is what about the pronunciation of Latin? I have seen comments that there is no correct pronunciation, since we do not know how it was pronounced. And I think that can be extended to ancient Greek as well.
Yeah, so, yeah, sorry, Lexi, did you want to?
Like, I have a question about that too. Is it Hesiod or Hesiod? I've literally heard it both ways from classicists. Like, how do we actually know? Go ahead. Finish your thought, Lelia. That's just a great point.
No, well, I mean, in answer to your question, I mean, I think that there are established kind of norms for how we pronounce ancient words in English or in other modern languages. And the important thing is consistency. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you say Hesiod or Hesiod, as far as I'm concerned, as long as
I've also heard Hessian, which I think.
Again, I mean, I think again, I'm a big fan of consistency.
Yeah, I mean, decide and stick to one. Yeah,
just stick to one. I mean, I think it's quite funny. I spend a lot of my time in Greece, and I don't want to, if there's anybody Greek in the audience, they might kind of like start sending me death threats. But the Greek people are quite passionate about the subject of ancient Greek and the kind of so-called Erasmian pronunciation of ancient Greek versus the kind of modern pronunciation of ancient Greek. And all I can really say is, so the classic example is hoi polloi, which means like the many, the majority, which is pronounced as ipoli in modern Greek, and hoi polloi being the Erasmian pronunciation, and ipoli being the modern Greek pronunciation. I mean, it's we could have literally an entire series of webinars on like historical linguistics and how like languages change and the reasons why we think that words were pronounced in a certain way, and it's people are continually arguing over it as well. But I mean, generally what we do with like historical linguistics is kind of, you compare lots of texts, and you compare, for example, you might look at a bit of Latin or Greek, and which is perhaps maybe the texts are 400 years apart or something, and you kind of compare how the words are, and you can make some quite good guesses about what kind of sounds were being made. Like it's not a science, unfortunately, although I even use the word science kind of with bated breath. But we can make some pretty good guesses about how things were pronounced. I mean, I did see a comment in the chat about, if living language speakers went back to Rome, they would just sound like absolute gobbledygook. I mean, yeah, they'd probably sound pretty strange, but people might just about be able to understand what they were saying. Yeah, I mean, we can make some, we can make some pretty good guesses as to how things were meant to sound. But there's always progress to be made in these areas.
I love that, as long as everybody sort of agrees on pronunciations. I remember when I did an interview with Madeline Miller, and it was like, the first question was like, do we say Circe? I mean, and she's like, let's just go for that one because that's what everybody likes saying. And that's gonna, the whole point of what a lot of us are trying to do right now is trying to make the classics accessible, try to make them enjoyable. And I think part of that is allowing different pronunciations and letting people relax a little bit about that and be like, don't worry, you're not going to be judged. Nobody really knows. For me, it's like the best thing ever that we don't actually know the pronunciations, because I'm really bad at that kind of stuff. It's wonderful. I feel so relieved. I can make a mistake and not get crucified. So now.
My forthcoming book on civility and civil discourse is coming out from St. Martin's Press, and I make the same point about social norms, how there's not necessary for so many norms, there's not an inherent right or wrong. It's just the fact that a society, a given place, a given time has decided this is what we're going to do, like driving on the left or right hand side of the road, or eating with a fork, eating with a chopstick. Like, there's not an inherent moral value or goodness to any one of those decisions. It's just the fact that a society said this is what we're doing, and everyone in that given culture, even a visitor, should comply just because it serves that social coordination function. And it is interesting though that there's this human tendency to look down on people who do things, say things, act differently, Hesiod, tomato, tomato, Hesiod, Hesiod kind of thing. But to have that humility that Anya was saying, that we don't actually know, but just to have grace for people that approach it differently. But yeah.
Yeah, can I just say on behalf of dyslexics of the world, we appreciate that. Can I ask, because we were talking about the importance of translations, we've got a question. I think we'll want to be wrapping up pretty soon, but I think this would be a really, really valuable practical question for a lot of people. For you, Lalia, is what are some of the translations you would recommend? Because that is, you are very proficient in languages. For people who aren't, your opinion really matters, and that it would be a wonderful resource to find people who can kind of advocate for certain translations over another. So would you have some specific Greek or Latin translators that you would promote over others, and lead us in the path of best translators?
I mean, I
can't hear you. In fact,
I can hear.
Can you hear? Oh, you can? Okay.
I'm
okay,
not
go ahead.
muted,
Sorry.
but Lexi, you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So I would say not to focus on what, I mean, actually, I do think that why not start with the Emily Wilson? It's fresh, it's contemporary, it's really nice. She's written a really nice, kind of introduction on her thought process behind it, and start with her, but go and have a look at one of the classics as well. Go and have a look at Fagles, go have a look at translations, so for the classics, I would say why not start with Emily Wilson and take it from there. I would say that maybe kind of avoid the, I mean, to be honest, I don't want to say to avoid anyone, because I think all the translations are great and they've all got their merits. Also you want to be part of, I also think the other really nice thing about classics is because it's a discipline which is constantly having to defend itself. I always found myself at school being kind of like at parent teacher meetings, being kind of literally walked into a corner by parents being like, well, I want you to now justify why you teach Latin at this school. And so I'd have to find myself, you know, defending my position quite a lot. And I think the classicists are like often under attack to kind of convince people why we're relevant. But it also means that everybody from like, you know, Mary Beard to someone teaching Latin in a school in the countryside somewhere in the UK are kind of, they're just as eloquent at defending the need for the subject. You know, it doesn't matter that they're kind of poles apart in terms of like what they're teaching, who they're teaching, the research they're doing. And so I think the nice thing about classics is it's because it's a subject that's always having to defend itself. It's a subject that's like continually alive, actually. And so be part of the, you know, become part, you know, get part of the dialogue. And so read Emily, because she's, you know, that's a good place to start. You can be part of the contemporary discussion, and then you can move up to other translations as well, or have a look at the original Greek or whatever. You know, to be honest, if you do want to just get to know the Latin and the Greek, the Loeb editions, which I think are published by Harvard now, you know, they're parallel translations, like Greek on one side, English on the other. That's really good if you're just trying to kind of get a handle on what the words mean, and just kind of try and put the Greek and the Latin into context. I'll stop talking now.
No, I think those are excellent points. And I love Emily Wilson. And as we were saying before, Classical Wisdom is actually sponsoring a cruise in September with Emily Wilson and Bill Irvine as they trace the steps of Odysseus. So I'm always talking about how great her translations are. So I'm happy that you brought her up. One other thing I'd just like to give another shout out to, though, is I just really love this idea right now of the living Latin and a lot of these events that are happening, that people are really trying to make these ancient languages both, you know, accessible to lots of different people, but make them more alive, to bring them back. And so I just want to say there's a really interesting event happening on April 8th in just a few days called the Delphi Classics. And it's a whole event in ancient Greek and Latin. Different professors are all meeting in Delphi to do this. So if anyone's interested in that, I can put the link for it in the chat. That'll be an online option as well. But I think we should finish up pretty soon, but I just want to say, like, maybe one last question for both of you guys is for people who are interested in getting into the classics, either as an older person, as a student, or as a mother wanting to teach their kids. What would you guys recommend to get people involved?
Shall I answer that question?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So if we're thinking about, I mean, you do want a good textbook, and I noticed in the chat that there was some discussion about what textbooks people were using. The Cambridge Latin course dates from the 60s, and yeah, somebody mentioned in the chat, you know, it's quite common that teachers especially in the UK, teach from the Cambridge Latin course. The stories are excellent. But yeah, sometimes they're a bit too long and difficult. And it's true that it's not quite sort of, it doesn't quite introduce the grammar as methodically as one might want. I mean, I learned from a series called Ecce Romani, which are, you know, little books with, you know, quite dated by now illustrations, but very cute little stories of best friends living in the countryside, and they get to Rome and all the ins and outs. And that's quite good that's got nice little quite short chapters on historical stuff in there as well. And I find that that is kind of nice. That would probably be nicer if you were an adult learning, because they gloss quite a lot of the vocabulary, but you're not kind of limited to just kind of like reading stuff in the present tense for the first kind of 8 months or whatever. So it's and there are a couple of new ones out as well. There's De Romanis, which I haven't taught from as well. But I would say that, and there's the Oxford Latin course also, which my father is quite keen on. He's a teacher. But yeah, I think Cambridge Latin course is great. Ecce Romani is great. I'd say maybe, I'm just trying to think if one is better for adults. I mean, you might find that something like De Romanis might be better for adults. But yeah, I mean, they've all got their benefits and merits. I mean, I would say, yeah.
Are these curricula to learn ancient Greek that you're suggesting, Lalia, or just?
Oh, these are all Latin, actually. I think for Greek, so I mean, for Greek, I would use something like, so in fact, there's the Joint Association of Classical Teachers have something called Reading Greek, and that's what Cambridge, I think, used to teach their Greek from scratch, the Ab Initio Greek. And I would definitely recommend that for adults. It's quite demanding, and but it introduces like a lot of history, a lot of concepts quite quickly. So it's challenging. So like if you want a nice challenge, I think the Reading Greek by the JACT. But if you, for example, for younger learners, I would say something like John Taylor, Ancient Greek. Yeah.
So Lalia's answer is from the big C classics perspective, like the discipline of classics, the learning of ancient languages. I'll answer adjacently from the small C classics perspective, like where if you want to engage the great conversation, where to begin. My principle is, throw a wide net, pick up a number of books that you've always wanted to engage in, and see where your interests follow, a lead, and then follow that. I think there's a great line that Samuel Johnson has in Boswell's biography of Johnson, where he talks about how we remember more, we retain much more knowledge when we're following our own intellectual interests, as opposed to having content shoved down our throat. Funnily enough, this is why St. Augustine hated ancient Greek. He resolved to never learn it because he had one professor who like beat him for not doing it well enough, and he's like, I will never touch it again. He was traumatized from an early age from and never learned ancient Greek. So pick up Plato, pick up St. Augustine, pick up Dostoevsky, and these great works, fiction, nonfiction, and see what you're interested in, and all too frequently they will reference other authors. So pick up those authors and just see where just follow your curiosity. Let that lead you. That's the underappreciated benefit of being a lifelong learner. Like, you're not in the classroom anymore, and you're able to chart your own agenda, your own pedagogy, your own curricula, and which is the best curricula, because you're doing it for its own sake, and you're doing it because you enjoy it, and because you realize that engaging these texts and ideas and questions can make your life better and richer.
I think that's beautifully said. Thank you both. And I think, on that note, we should probably finish up. But I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. I think a good conclusion is that we should just continue learning ancient languages, but it doesn't have to be restricted to just ancient Greek and Latin. That the love of languages, there are 8-9 billion humans on the earth. We can specialize enough and keep them all alive, I reckon. So I think it's a wonderful endeavor. The pursuit of philology and understanding any language will really open up whole worlds. So special thanks to Lalia Lloyd for joining us today and bringing your insight and expertise. And Lexi, if you want to say goodbye, and I'll say thank you to everybody as well.
Yes, poor Anya. She's been so amazing being with us today. She's very sick and has just been such a trooper, and you've done an amazing job. Thank you, Anya, for
thanks for putting up with me, guys. I'm like
for enduring and facilitating so well, despite go back to bed as soon as this is over. But thank you all for sharing some of your afternoon with us to contemplate these really interesting questions. What do these thousand-year-old languages of ancient Greek and Latin, why are they useful today? And what is the utility of other ancient languages, or any second language at all? I think these are interesting questions in our increasingly globalized world. And I learned a lot from both Lalia and Anna and Anya, sorry, and I hope that all of you did as well. So thank you again for being here. And I'll just say, I think we have another event coming up in just a few weeks. What is the topic of that, Anya? Have we decided on a title yet?
I think it's The Love of Learning, and it's with Margarita Mooney, who is one of the founders of the Scala Institute, and is a very, very fascinating woman who's traveled around and dealt with insurgents in Nicaragua and studied the classics and has done all sorts of interesting things. So we're going to have another really fascinating conversation with her, I think in almost 3 weeks from now, at the end of the month.
And her initiative at the Scala Institute, she's a professor at Princeton University, and the Scala Institute is at Princeton as well. That initiative is to be a resource for lifelong learners. They facilitate reading groups and tutorials for people that are out of school that still long for the life of the mind, and they give outlets, opportunity for people to engage in that way. So it's a wonderful initiative, a wonderful resource, and very much in the spirit of another event that we did with Zena Hintz at St. John's, where with her Catherine project, which also kind of democratizes the Oxford tutorial model for free. It's by donation or free for anyone who wants to enjoy, to dig into the Odyssey, to dig into Aeschylus, any sort of these classic works. So really, really grateful that people like Maria and Zena are sensing a need and a demand for these outlets, and they're creating them. So thank you again to all of you for joining us, and thanks again to Lalia. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that you guys will join us, that many of you will join us for our conversation later in April, and for others in the future. But have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.